President of the European Parliament and of the European Movement International. I'm Irish. I'm online with you from Dublin this afternoon. Those of you who are following us online can ask questions or make comments on the YouTube and Facebook chat functions. Thanks also to the firm VPS, the Foundation Service Provider, for making this online dialogue possible on what is a public holiday in the Canton de Vaud in Switzerland. Thanks also to the Foundation's team for preparing everything in advance. In particular, my thanks to Nathalie Troisfontaine and Eva Paul. A few words, if I may, about the Foundation for those of you who don't know us. Since our creation in 1978 by Jean Monnet himself, our foundation has been a living memory, as well as a place for reflection and discussion on major policy issues related to the European Union. Our activities are made possible by the generous support of the State of Vaud, the Swiss Confederation, the City of Lausanne, and the University of Lausanne. The Foundation has a unique archive, a documentation centre, and a specialised library. And these resources are open to all students and researchers who wish to deepen their knowledge of Europe. I turn now to introduce our distinguished guest this afternoon, and I'm really pleased to do so, and that is to introduce Timothy Gartenash. After reading modern history at Oxford, his research into the German resistance to Hitler took him to Berlin, where he lived in both the western and eastern halves of the divided city for several years. From there, he started to travel widely behind the Iron Curtain. Throughout the 1980s, he became one of the leading chroniclers and journalistic interpreters of Central and Eastern Europe's pathway from communism. Indeed, as an avid reader of his then and since then, I profited greatly by many of his insights. From 1986 to 87, he was a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. Since 1990, he's been a fellow of St. Anthony's College, Oxford, where he directs the European Studies Center, or directed it from 2001 to 2006, and is now Isaiah Berlin Professorial Fellow. Indeed, I should say to you, Timothy, one of my favorite insights from Isaiah Berlin is his definition of history as being like geology, that to understand what's on the surface, you have to know how the geology and the structure has been laid beneath the surface. Timothy became a senior fellow of the Hoover Institution, Stanford University in 2000. In addition to his scientific work, his other activities also include involvement in the Berlin-Brandenburg Academy of Sciences, writing regular columns for the Guardian, and he's also published in leading European newspapers, as well as many contributions for the New York Review of Books. It's an honor for me also to find myself sharing with Timothy Gartenash the privilege of having received the Charlemagne Prize at Aachen. He did so in 2017. In my own case, it related to the EU's Big Bang enlargement and was of an earlier vintage dating back to 2004. This distinction, as you may know, honors exceptional work performed in the service of European unity. And so to our subject. The German legislative elections, which are just a few days away, in the first instance, of course, are a matter for the citizens and the voters of the Federal Republic themselves. But given its location, its size, its comparative wealth, necessarily these elections also are matters of genuine interest to much wider publics in the European Union, the transatlantic community, and all those seeking to better understand the likely geopolitical and geoeconomic evolution of the European Union itself. I think, moreover, on this occasion, with Chancellor Merkel stepping down after 15 years in office, in fact, I looked today to see it's 15 years and 301 days, so the guts of 16 years, there will be a changing of the guard in the Federal Chancellery, the Kanzleramt in Berlin. This will entail some change of style. We'll have to see who emerges as the next chancellor, and of course, probable changes in substance. So how will the post-election Germany impact the big issues of the day? How will a new German government wish to balance the costs of a post-COVID recovery with sustainable public finances? How will it deal with the urgency of climate change? How will it choose to address the post-Trump Biden foreign policy promise of America being back, but leaving a lot of people wondering back to what end, by what means, and with whom? What will a post-Merkel Germany wish to bring to the wider EU stage? Where will it stand on President Macron's idea of strategic autonomy, on security and defense, on relations with China and Russia? And not least among our questions, of course, given the degree of fragmentation of contemporary politics, which combination of parties may emerge to lead Germany in the coming years? Which political bedfellows are most likely to form the next coalition government? And how long are they likely to need to hammer out a coherent programme on which all can agree? So, Timothy Gartenash, it's a large canvas. I invite you to bring it where you will, just 6 days in advance of important elections for Germany, and necessarily, therefore, important for Europe and the wider world. You have the floor.
Well, thank you very much. And it's a great pleasure to be doing this with you. And of course, what better place than the Jean Monnet Foundation for Europe to talk about an election which has such significance for the future of Europe. I know we say that often, but I think in this case, it really is true. Actually, I think there are, if one goes back through the history of the Federal Republic, there are relatively few elections to compare. Maybe 1969, which opened the way for Willy Brandt's new Ostpolitik, and of course, the East German election in 1990, which opened the way for German unification. I want to make 5 points just in introduction. The first one being that a really strong, not just pro-European, but reform-minded German government is so crucial to the future of the European Union. I'm actually writing at the moment a personal history of contemporary Europe, looking at the last 50 years for the most part. And broadly speaking, one can tell the story of Europe since 1945 as an ascent, a gradual, non-continuous ascent with many reverses, until somewhere between, I would say, 2005 and 2009-10. Mm-hmm. But starting with the French and Dutch referendums on the Constitutional Treaty, and then in earnest, since the financial crisis segued into the Eurozone crisis, Europe has been like a heavyweight boxer in the ring, just being hit from left, from right, from left, and from right again by crisis after crisis, Eurozone crisis, Ukraine crisis, in which, of course, you were very much involved, refugee crisis, Brexit crisis, populism crisis, Donald Trump and the transatlantic crisis, COVID crisis. One can go on, just a series of crisis after crisis. And while Next Generation EU and the Recovery Fund is a very impressive response to the latest of those crises, the COVID crisis, and in a sense, a response to the last one but five, i.e. the Eurozone crisis, nonetheless, there is a huge agenda for the EU. And one has to say, without wanting to do a total sort of Merkel balance sheet, that Angela Merkel is partly responsible for that long to-do list. So on the plus side, it's a very big plus. She has personified the best Europe, the best Germany we have ever had. Moderate, reasonable, liberal, civilized, always seeking a peaceful compromise. And she has kept the show on the road through all these crises. Very often she's been the key player in reaching a compromise in Europe on many of these issues. That's a big achievement. But on the minus side, there are what the theologians would call the sins of omission, the things that she didn't do rather than the things she did do. In my book, I have to say, as a historian, the biggest of those is not giving a decisive response to the first phase of the Eurozone crisis. In my view, if she had done what Helmut Kohl would have done and actually asked her to do from his wheelchair as a very old man, namely say from the very start, we must do whatever it takes, keep the Eurozone going, the actual cost of doing that would have been much smaller. And a very negative narrative would not have established itself in German public opinion about the Eurozone, which has been very difficult to go up against. But also, even in respect of relations with Russia or China, European energy policy, I mentioned Nord Stream 2, a bunch of other issues, digital perhaps also, certain reforms inside Germany. There's a long to-do list where she's kept the show on the road, but she hasn't made the really decisive strategic move forward. So that's point number one, enormous strategic importance for Europe. Point number two, German elections have often been regarded by despairing journalists as very boring affairs. And this one is a curious case because it's simultaneously very boring and very exciting. It's very boring because the four mainstream parties, Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, Free Democrats, and Greens, have a lot of overlap between their policies, much more overlap than between Tories and Labour in the UK, let alone Republicans and Democrats in the US, so that the politics are still, in large measure, consensual politics of the centre, except, of course, for Die Linke on the left and the AfD on the right. And indeed, if you watch the TV debates, you know, there was an extraordinary amount of agreement and then some often rather artificial disagreement. But at the same time, it's extraordinarily exciting because we all know it's so important and nobody knows what coalition is going to come out of it. The only thing we know is that a coalition is going to come out of it. But as you hinted in your introduction, you know, conversation in Berlin, I just come back from Berlin, from a few days in Berlin. Conversation in Berlin is littered with code names. Jamaica,
yes,
Light, Deutschland, R2G, Kenya, it goes on and on. And all of them are these code names derived from the colors of the different parties for all the different possible coalitions. There has never been a time in the entire history of the Federal Republic where so many different coalitions have been arithmetically possible if one looks at the current opinion polls. And of course, as you know very well, with the quite complex German electoral system, partly direct mandates and then topped up for PR purposes, that makes working out what's going to come out of that mix almost impossible. In that sense, it's extremely exciting because nobody knows. But and this goes to my third point. The one thing we do know is that it's going to be a coalition and almost certainly a three-party coalition and not a two-party coalition. And that, I think, is a significant point. By the way, when you mentioned Angela Merkel's 301 and counting days as Chancellor, Pat, she may well get to 365.
It's true.
Those coalition talks, first you will have after the 26th of September what are called Sondierungsgespräche, exploratory talks, in which the FDP in particular will be flirting with both sides, with the Christian Democrats and with the Social Democrats. So there'll be a lot of initial exploration. And then, as you know, you have always long, complicated coalition negotiations. So the joke is that we may yet hear another New Year's speech on television from Angela Merkel in another colorful jacket. And she may make her 365 days. But at the end of the day, unless things go badly wrong, we will have a coalition. It will almost certainly be a three-party coalition. And the two front runners, as you know, are Jamaica, that is to say, the Christian Democrats, the Greens, and yellow for the Free Democrats, or the traffic light, Social Democrats, Green, and yellow, the Free Democrats. Mm-hmm. Those are the two really front runners, although others will be arithmetically possible. And Christian Lindner of the Free Democrats will be the kingmaker up to a point. And his demand will be the finance ministry. This is absolutely crystal clear. I talked to Christian Lindner a few years ago, and he said to me already then, after the last failed Jamaica coalition talks, you know, there's only one ministry in Berlin. It's the finance ministry. And he's going to strike a hard bargain and have a hard line and go for the finance ministry. But his bargaining power is not unlimited, because while he can start by playing with both sides, he's got at some point to commit to coalition talks and remember that he already pulled out once before, last year. So it really becomes a bit more difficult to keep your reputation as a serious, responsible politician if you pull out a second time and open the door for a red-red-green coalition, bringing in the extreme left-wing Die Linke party into a substantive coalition. So at a certain point, he'll have to knuckle down and get serious. Now, that's going to be a very difficult conversation, Jamaica or traffic light, because the positions are very different. And the unfortunate consequence for Europe of this is that you're going to get a less clear, sharp German position for Europe on most issues, right? Because inevitably you made a compromise between these. I mean, particularly the gulf between the Greens and the Free Democrats is very significant, notably on the Eurozone. What very much impresses me, apropos your list of big challenges, is the degree of serious thinking about climate change. In a very impressive way, German politics has really woken up to the challenge. Credit to the Greens for putting it at the top of the agenda. And what is more, they're talking to German business about it. So if you listen to the debates, it's not just about what we're going to do, it's about what we're going to do with German business to make the transition. So I think that's going to be a very positive impulse for the European institutions, Franz Timmermans, and the climate change agenda. Very positive. At the other end, I think the least positive is the other one you touched on, which is particularly after the unilateral, effectively American withdrawal from Afghanistan. And some would say after AUKUS, US, UK, and Australia. Is the EU going to get serious about strategic autonomy, European sovereignty? There's not a great deal of substance in that direction. There's a lot of announced goodwill, for example, endorsing QMV on foreign policy. All the main parties endorse qualified majority voting on European foreign policy, but there's not a huge amount of substance there. Here I come to my fourth point, which is obviously high on the list of big issues, is the interrelated subjects of post-COVID economic recovery and Eurozone. Because Southern Europe, along with Eastern Europe, has been hit hardest by COVID, as they were hit hardest by the refugee crisis, and before that by the Eurozone crisis. So the real test for the coherence of the European Union is, does Southern Europe now make a good recovery, helped by Next Generation EU? And this inclines me, I'm going to declare my cards here. I don't belong to any party at all, never have, never will. I'm entirely independent. But thinking about it from the Jean Monnet future of Europe perspective, I think the traffic light would be the better of the two for the European Union, partly because the Christian Democrats have been in power for so long. all parties ultimately need a bit of recovery time. And after being in power for so long, look at the Conservatives in 1997 in Britain. Partly because, to be quite frank, and I'm not alone in this opinion, I think Olaf Scholz is a more convincing candidate for the job of Chancellor. He's been Vice Chancellor, he's been Finance Minister. We know what we've got with him. He's at the least a safe pair of hands, but also because on this crucial question of North-South inside the European Union, about the Eurozone, where, let's be clear, Germany is a kind of hegemon. About it. Germany is not. It's not true to say that Germany is the hegemon in the entire EU. It's not. There's not much it can do on its own. But in the Eurozone, it's coming pretty close to the textbook definition of a hegemon, whatever the constitutional theory. And if you think of a Chancellor Scholz between a very hardline Christian Lindner as finance minister, who is saying, stick to the Stability and Growth Pact, Next Generation EU Recovery Fund is just a one-off. Never again. We're not giving any more money to the, profligate South. And the Greens, who want a structural fiscal union, a permanent fiscal union for the Eurozone. If you have Scholz in the middle, I think he is able to show much more flexibility on that subject. To be clear, he's not going to say we want a permanent fiscal union. The politics are not there in Germany for that. But he is able to demonstrate more pragmatic flexibility when it comes to extending the arrangements in the recovery fund as and when it becomes necessary, making more ad hoc arrangements. And for me, Pat, that is absolutely crucial, because it's not just about preventing the Eurozone from collapsing. That every German government will do. It's about making sure the Eurozone works for the South and not just for the North. So that's my fourth point. My final point, since you talked about Isaiah Berlin and the geology of history, let me do a bit of geology. Let's think about Germany's role in Europe in a much longer historical perspective. Germany is clearly, again, the central power in Europe, no doubt about it, even more so after Brexit, by the way. Of course, there's very little it can do simply on its own. It needs France, it needs a couple of other major middle state and a few middle-sized European states. It needs support from the European institutions, but it has an extraordinary, a unique power and position. And if one thinks in historical perspective, toute proportion gardée, the most comparable period is that after 1871, when a united Germany, first time united, was a modern, economically dynamic, powerful country in the center of Europe, seeking to find its role in the European concert. And of course, that didn't end very well, as we know, in 1914 to 1945. Now, the wonderful historian of Germany, Fritz Stern, great friend, much missed, recalled walking through divided Berlin in the early 1960s, and Raymond Aron saying to him, Fritz, it could have been Germany's century. It could have been Germany's century. And they blew it. And Fritz, after German unification post-1989, said, this is Germany's second chance. Second chance. Use it well. And broadly speaking, Germany, certainly domestically, has used it well since 1989, but it's still in that position. And in a sense, the more difficult, if we think in the loose historical analogy that we're now in the 1900s, more difficult challenges, the larger strategic and geopolitical challenges of the second chance, are only coming at Germany now.
Mm.
So there is a very great deal in historical terms, I think, at stake here in how Germany answers the very big challenges that it faces now, as it seeks to use the historic second chance better this time. That's what I wanted to say in introduction. I look forward to the conversation.
Well, that is, it's really fascinating. Thank you for that tour de force and tour d'horizon. Let me, if I can, following your structure, come back to your first observation. I love the image you have of the punch-drunk heavyweight in European terms, and I agree with it very much. It has been one crisis after another, some from without, some from within, and very difficult. And you talked about Chancellor Merkel's role. Now, I know this isn't a conversation to do a full balance sheet, but I think I might pause for a thought there on that with you. The positives, as you saw, the middle of the road, keep the show on the road, the civilized quality, the moderation, the search for a consensus, but also a sense of, I suppose, the incrementalist instinct that she brought to policy making being insufficient for the weight of some of the challenges. So let me come to the big one of those. You said in a kind of a way, she missed the bus, if I may put that phrase, on the Eurozone crisis. We had to wait for Mario Draghi many years later to talk about doing whatever it takes to stabilize that. Did she have the room for maneuver? And here I'm thinking of things like the fact that only a few years, in fact, right at the early stage of the crisis, but before we fully understood it, Germany had gone through a constitutional reform and introduced the Schuldenbremse to control debt and structural deficits, and to address Bundesbank and other fears that the golden rule about investment had stretched the credibility. So it was now the Constitution saying, we're the guys at home, before we move abroad who have this. You had the interventionist nature of the German Constitutional Court in Karlsruhe, willing to clip the wings about stepping forward and bring it back within German political dynamics. And frankly, whether it was, Bild Zeitung or public opinion polls, there was an awful lot of stuff that said, Southern profligacy, that's not our problem, we're not paying the bill. Would she have had the room for maneuver, even if she wasn't the incrementalist that she had been, to actually do something dramatic?
So it's an excellent question, and you're quite right to say that the probably two most respected institutions in Germany, particularly in West Germany, the Bundesbank and the Bundesverfassungsgericht, the Constitutional Court, were expressing all sorts of reservations about the structure of the monetary union. That said, it is a Kanzlerdemokratie. There's a wonderful book by the historian Arnulf Baring called Adenauer's Kanzlerdemokratie. And its wonderful first sentence is, Im Anfang war Adenauer. In the beginning was Adenauer. And the fact is that the chancellor in this system has an extraordinary leadership position if he or she chooses to use it. She didn't use it. The method known as Merkel to Merkeln was a way to be very cautious, to see which way the wind blows, and then gradually to move your way. And for that particular moment, that was just the wrong thing to do, because while she was waiting, two things happened. Firstly, the financial market smelt blood. They started thinking, hey, well, maybe Germany doesn't want to keep Greece in the Eurozone. And B, as you rightly said, the German media, not least the Bild Zeitung, got on its high horse with this really misleading narrative of the virtuous, hard-working, sparsam North Europeans and the profligate, corrupt South Europeans. And that narrative became established in German minds. Now, if she had got up on day two, as Helmut Kohl would have done, and said, dear compatriots, we have been the greatest beneficiaries from the Eurozone, which is true. Our own banks bear some responsibility for the mess we got in with their irresponsible lending to the South. And anyway, the Eurozone is now the central institution of the entire European project, and therefore we have to do whatever it takes. And done that with all the immense authority of her office. Believe me, the financial markets would have gone away, as they did 2 years later when Draghi said whatever it takes. And the narrative would have been a different one in a large part of German public opinion. So it's an absolutely fair question, but I think my verdict holds.
To be perfectly frank with you on that particular issue, I don't dispute it, but I felt honor bound in any event to put that question. Indeed, I recall as a footnote to what you say, I think if I got the date right, it was a 1952 debt conference in London that relieved the post-war Germany of a massive part of the debt burden it carried. And one of the really interesting things, there's a wonderful study done by the University of Munich that looked at dealing with debt burden. And they found that the financial markets, in spite of all the suggestions by commentators of the country, when you clean up a debt mess, quickly come back to lend to you on good rates. And so that lesson also of kind of modern German history was lost in contemporary German leadership. Let me turn, if I could, to, again, your second thesis, the boarding elections. An interesting a thought came to my mind for those who on continental Europe or elsewhere who might see our conversation may not have seen ads that I think were on British television and Irish television over many years for a company called Black & Decker. And Black & Decker make little drills for at home and so on. And their tagline was, Black & Decker makes boarding exciting. Mm-hmm. And so when you said it, it came to my mind, because I do think there's no doubt in reading all the reports, they've been pretty low-key debates with occasional little interpersonal flare-ups. But I'm wondering just on that, let's take some of the candidates. Armin Laschet has in some respects, and this is for anyone, the misfortune to have to follow a chancellor, whatever the assessment will be in time, who has had such a dramatic and lasting leadership role to play over such a long period of time. And he had to be the party leader while she was still in office. So was he, in a way, apart from his own locally created difficulties in some of the TV images we've seen after the floods and so on, was he already kind of handcuffed by the fact that he was half in, he's the leader of the party, but half out because the leader of the country was his former party leader for almost 2 decades?
Yes, I think that's true. On the other hand, really, as you vividly remember at the outset, for some time, we were all thinking Jamaica. We were all thinking that Christian Democrats still had it. And it really is a case where his personal conduct of the campaign, I mean, look, people, the proof of this is the way the SPD ratings shot up. Which was not to do with the SPD's program, believe me. It was not to do with the substance. People were treating this as a presidential election. The one question in their minds is, who's going to be the best chancellor? Angela Merkel has given us this extraordinary feeling of security and safety, a sort of happy island in the center of Europe, somehow insulated from all the problems plaguing European countries all around. Who is going to convey that sense to us? And I think it really was the personal qualities, or if you will, the personal images conveyed on television of the candidates that played an outsized role, plus the fact that Armin Laschet, to be honest, was offering Merkel only less so.
Well, an interesting thing, as again, observing it from a distance, and I haven't been in Berlin for any part of this campaign, but Olaf Scholz has interestingly positioned himself as the SPD Kanzlerin, that he's the SPD's Angela. He is Mutti, except not quite. And so he has taken the robes of Mutti and put them on his shoulders, even as in principle they were conferred to be passed onto the shoulders of Laschet.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Even to the point, as you remember, when he famously did the Kanzler Rhombus, the famous rhombus-like gesture she makes with her hands, almost as a joke. No, I mean, someone referred to him as Fatih rather than Mutti. But of course, the other thing that's helping him enormously is that the motto of the election is time for a change, but please not too much change. And he's just that perfect mix of change, but also continuity.
Well, let me come to your third thesis today, and I think again you're on the button. The odds are that it will be whichever combination, a three-party coalition rather than a two-party coalition, and of course there will be jockeying for position as well as for policy preference in this. But on that front, you have argued that was the experience as Vice Chancellor, the experience as Finance Minister, that Scholz is well placed to take the outliers if you have the coalition, let's say FDP and Greens involved, that you have your traffic light coalition, you have quite distinct preferences for the conduct of financial policy and by extension for the conduct of European financial policy. So could I ask you to develop the point, which indeed you made, that Scholz in the middle could be someone who can strike a better balance? So on the European side, with the Recovery and Resilience Fund, not surprisingly, for all the reasons that you mentioned about the South, about COVID, about the Eurozone crisis and its legacy, Italy gets a very big slice of that. Yeah. And Italy at the moment has, in my own view, the good fortune to have someone of the quality of Mario Draghi, who spent a lot of time thinking, what's he going to ask Brussels for? He gets the money, but he has to kind of submit his report card in advance. And I can see that they're putting a huge amount, for example, into investment in much better transport links for southern Italy, Mezzogiorno and Sicily. They're doing it in modern links that will be digitally friendly and that will be environment friendly. And so you can see in it a logic of a significant sense of not investing for the next election, but of investing for the next generation. And my guess is Europe is going to have to get better at that, investing in the next generation, than it is seen to have been. And therefore, this issue of the semi-permanence of some of these new structures won't go away. So what's your instinct if Scholz can strike a German balance to form a coalition as to what he would bring to a European balance where these needs are also contested? I mean, there's a group of nations much more conservative than Germany in their self-expression about this, and indeed delayed the recovery fund for a long time. And there's a group of nations in more need of funding who put their hand up for it but can't always get what they need.
Well, indeed, there's a Frugal Four and a Hanseatic League, and to which I believe Ireland now belongs. So
that is correct. The Protestant ethic is working well in the post-Catholic Ireland. Yeah.
So a small point and a larger one. The small point is that remember that Scholz sat in the finance ministry for the last 4 years. I was there a few days ago talking to his right-hand man, Wolfgang Schmidt. So he knows everything about the way the finances work. So he's very well placed to command a technical argument with Christian Lindner, for example, as the finance minister. And often, as you know very well, compromises take the form of complex technical solutions or fixes. That's a small point. The larger point is that the amount of money going to Italy is staggering. I mean, over 190 billion euros. What a blessing they have Mario Draghi there. Nonetheless, an awful lot will depend on how well that money is indeed spent. And as you rightly said, seen to be spent. In other words, if Scholz is up against a raft of German media stories 18 months hence, saying, look how this money has been wasted on luxury hotels and the mafia and heaven knows what, that is a very difficult position to be in. But if indeed we can tell a story about how well this money has been spent, how it's helping the entire European economy, including, of course, German exporters who will be contributing to that recovery, and if he has for partners Emmanuel Macron, which is not a certainty after next spring's election, not a certainty, and a sensible government in Spain, and still Mario Draghi, who hasn't popped across to be president in Italy, but remains prime minister seeing this through, then you really have one of those European moments where you have the stars aligning for something very positive, as one had in the mid-1980s, for example. So I think potentially it's a very interesting moment. And if there's a really positive mood music around that recovery and the way recovery funds have been spent, then I think with the authority of the Chancellor, and by the way, with his own record of fiscal prudence, because he's been a very fiscally prudent finance minister himself, Scholz is able to do a bit more.
I'm just looking here. I've got a chat line up in front of me. We're getting some material in. One comment here, as a German voter, I'll just read it through to you. I recognize everything being said. The likelihood is a tripartite coalition, which is not able to agree on a sharp and clear line. Could this, however, be a boon for Europe, is the question.
Excellent question, to which my answer is sorry, I'm afraid not. I don't think it is a boon for Europe because, in an EU of 27, you're bound to be making very significant compromises to achieve a European position. So I don't think it's a great advantage if the German position is already a rather tense compromise between different party positions. So I think not. I mean, what I have argued in a recent commentary and what I also believe is that this is really the great test of both the German and the European model of change through consensus. That is, after all, what distinguishes the European way of doing democracy, and particularly the German way of doing democracy, from the British or the American. Winner takes all. Deeply adversarial, but decisive. I mean, you sure as hell can get a clear line. So I think this moment, these next few years, are the great test of change through consensus, both in Germany itself and at the European level. I don't think having an awkward three-party coalition is an advantage, but I think if you had Germany, France, Italy, and Spain, and a few other significant member states, all pushing in the same direction on a number of key issues, that would more than compensate for it.
We have another observation stroke question in which comes from a slightly different angle, but it's the same issue. If and only if, it says, others, notably the European Commission, is able to play the driving role, there'll be more room for finding at least one party inside the German government willing to do some of the heavy lifting and support them.
So since we're talking in the Jean Monnet Foundation, this is really a key point. It really is a key point, is it not? And, to turn that round another way, imagine a Europe in which Angela Merkel said, I'm going to go off and be president of the European Council. Emmanuel Macron said, I'm going to be president of the European Commission.
Mm.
Mario Draghi said, I'm going to take on the European Parliament. And you see my point. In other words, people really thought that the key place to go was to head the European institutions, to give the kind of leadership that we have had from time to time from those institutions, don't get me wrong. That would be a major plus. So that it's as much.
We seem to have a technical breakdown. Is it that on my side? Can I get someone to confirm if it's general or is it just with me? Timothy, are you back online?
Was I off?
Well, I don't know whose internet connection is unstable. For a certain moment there, you froze for me, but perhaps not for everyone else.
Anyway, let me just say it again. So it's partly, as it were, a demand side problem. That is to say, do the national leaders really want big hitters at the top of the European institutions? That's a fact. As well as a supply side problem. Do we have the figures who are willing to do it and able to do it? But I mean, I do agree, because working on this book, you know, I was looking at how Delors operated in the 1980s, and it's really fascinating because he had his own agenda, but what he does right at the start is to go around all the national capitals, say what's important to you, makes his table, identifies a single market at the point of maximum shared interest, and goes for it. And that's the way you get movement forward. I mean, to be fair, I think something of that kind has happened on the issue of climate change and green transformation. I'm rather upbeat about that. I think the Commission really has a pretty good agenda on that subject. Actually, the EU as a whole does, and it does tally with a lot of the national politics.
Let me, if I can, come to kind of near neighbours and Germany post-election coping with some of the challenges. We see the endless tension between the European Union institutions and Poland and Hungary on a whole array of issues. And we see the European Parliament wanting to make some of the spending of the recovery fund in some of these states conditional on certain actions. What is your sense of what Germany will want to bring to the table on those questions?
So this is, as you very well know, a question close to my heart, because I've spent more than 40 years writing about Central and Eastern Europe and following the whole story of the liberation of countries like Poland and Hungary. So to see them now experiencing the erosion of democracy, the very far-reaching erosion of democracy in the case of Hungary since 2010, is profoundly depressing. And I have to say, this is one of Merkel's sins of omission. It just is. Because Germany had a uniquely strong position in relation to Hungary because of history, because of the huge presence of German business in Hungary, and because of the EPP.
Yes.
It is being part of the EPP. So your old institution and, you know, the European Parliament was really important in this respect. And she just pulled her punches. She wasn't prepared to get tough on that issue for reasons one could discuss, that it is a big omission because we have seen the far-reaching erosion of democracy in a full member state of the European Union. That's a shocker. That's not meant to happen. That's not what Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union says. It's a real shocker. So the question is very well taken. Now, the EU institutions, in particular the Parliament, are now getting serious about this. I'm absolutely delighted that they're quite rightly holding up the recovery funds for Poland and Hungary, that there is, in theory, a linkage beginning to be made between the Europe of money and the Europe of values, which is the key thing that has to happen. You can't go on violating core European values and raking in billions of euros in EU funds. That can't be allowed to continue. Position of the new German government, key player here is the Greens. The Greens have been very strong on the agenda of rule of law, human rights, democracy in Russia, in China, in East Central Europe. Short summary, my guess is that because the interests, including business interests, in the Russian and Chinese relationships are so powerful in Germany, the Greens will not affect a major change in Russia policy or China policy, but they have to get something on that agenda. And I think they may get something more on Poland and Hungary. So if the position of the German government hardens, as it certainly should, it will be a response not only to what's happening in Poland and Hungary, not only to what's happening in Brussels, but also to that internal argument in the coalitions with the Germans, with the Greens in particular, saying, we've got to get serious on this issue.
And let me, if I may, for a moment, follow that logic. Getting serious on the issue, each action has a reaction, will cause the counterparties, the governments in Warsaw and in Budapest, presumably to exercise whatever leverage they have in a European Union easily subject to gridlock because of unanimity requirements. So like a boomerang, does it come back to hit you? This is not because it shouldn't be addressed, but as you address it, does it impose additional gridlock costs on Europe's ability to move forward?
Where you need unanimity. So Poland and Hungary threatened to veto on the budget and of course got a softening of the rule of law linkage requirement at the end of last year. However, to complicate the picture, public opinion in both these countries is very strongly pro-EU membership, very strongly, well over 80%. And there are major opposition parties. So up to a point, Orban in Hungary and Kaczynski in Poland can win support by seeming to hang tough, particularly against, say, European courts. But beyond a certain point, it threatens to boomerang back against them as public opinion gets worried. Okay, they may say, hey, you're blackmailing us, but if I'm the Polish builder or the Polish farmer and I'm not getting the structural funds because of what the government has done, then the calculus changes, in addition to which Hungary has an election next spring. And it is not totally impossible that the now united opposition might win it, and the united opposition would be very strongly encouraged by a stronger EU stance at precisely this moment. So given that you don't have any really big issues like a budget that need unanimity at this point, obviously there are smaller ones, I would take the chance.
Okay, that's clear, and thank you for it. Let me, again, sticking with geography, but moving to two zones you've already mentioned, German relations with Russia and German relations with China. On the Russia front, could you do a quick stock taking, a bit like you did at the beginning, what you see as on the balance sheet of pluses and minuses to do with Germany, EU-Russia relations?
Well, indeed. I mean, without Germany, there is no European-Russia policy because German-Russian relations are just so important. And on the plus side, I would say that over Ukraine and its consequences, and now on Belarus, Angela Merkel has helped to keep EU unity on sanctions. You may disagree with the policy, think it should have been stronger, but there has been a policy and it has been an EU united policy on sanctions. And that, given German business interests, was not a given. I mean, it's a significant achievement. On the minus side, in my view, is Nord Stream 2, which it is simply not plausible to say is simply a business project. I mean, at this very moment, we are seeing Russia manipulating energy prices.
Indeed, maintenance problems with Gazprom, I think, is the polite phrase.
Remember that one for when I make to show that, you know, you need to use Nord Stream 2. So I do think that has been a big problem. Also in the perception of the East Europeans, they quite understandably saw this as a stab in the back because it's circumventing Poland and Ukrainian transit, also in the transatlantic relationship. So I think that one could hope for some adjustment of German-Russian policy to make it, if you like, a little bit tougher. And that would, in my view, be a good thing, but don't expect big changes. As I said before, there are so many major interests, notably business interests, involved there, and there will continue to be. Of course, it's very interesting, isn't it, that Washington, having been so tub-thumping about Nord Stream 2, has now accepted it and made a compromise on it. Now, the way I read that is, we're going to compromise with you, Germany, on Russia, because where we really need you is in relations with China. And so for me, the really strategic test case is not so much Russia as relations with China, where Germany has had an even more commercial, mercantilist policy than in relations with Russia. And the tension, the distance between that policy and where the United States would like Europe to be on China is very large. So that's a very, very big question mark on the agenda of the new German government.
Let me, if I could, for a moment, stick with the hypothesis that the Greens will be in government. They'll have a very strong agenda. They come at the right time. The European Commission has already also prepared the ground with the Fit for 55 program of Timmermans. The drive in this, if it works, for all of us, will be to hugely diminish reliance on fossil fuels and to greatly increase reliance on renewables. And of course, it is the fossil fuel connection that is a key pipeline of German-Russian relations and a key source of funding for the Kremlin and the Russian government and its social and economic policy. So with a very determined green German government in a determined and green European Union, albeit that Nord Stream 2 seems to run kind of counter-current, if I put it that way. The truth is, the more we diminish dependency on fossil fuels, the more that fundamental relationship in those terms risks itself also to diminish in terms of need, interest, and ultimately spill over into values and vision.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, a really effective green European energy policy to address the climate crisis would also be great for Russian policy. The problem there is, of course, amongst other things, that Germany has a long way to go on the so-called Energiewende and has ruled out civil nuclear power. And so, it's a very big leap to go to alternative energy sources without using civilian nuclear power along the way. And of course, the Greens are the first to say we don't want to get back into civil nuclear power ever. So that there's a big distance to travel. And I need not even mention the vast brown coal fields that you still see in Western Germany. I mean, an extraordinary sight if you ever drive past them. They look like the land of Mordor. So this is a country that has a way to go on this, which is why I emphasized at the beginning the connection with German business, because it seems to me that it's only if the really mighty German business sector really gets its head down and gets into alternative energy and alternative technologies, as we've seen to some extent with solar power in Bavaria, for example, that you can do that. So I think it's a point very well taken, but I think it's going to be a demanding transition, and by the way, expensive along the way. So you then come back to fiscal policy and who's going to pay for it. And if you've got a debt brake and a fiscally conservative finance minister who doesn't want to tax the rich more, where exactly you're going to get the money to pay for the transition.
Let me come, as you've done already a bit in commenting on US strategic policy, to Germany and China. Mrs. Merkel headed in that part of the EU Council presidency that continues to rotate every 6 months. Quite a successful German presidency. We had the recovery fund with the longest council meetings ever, I think, even bypassed the Nice record that had stood before under Chirac, but she got the job done. She also managed to complete the negotiations with China on a broad commercial deal. And there are a lot of very good things in that deal from a point of view of European interests and so on. But then, of course, Europe, Germany, gets caught up in the slipstream of American preferences about China. And the American preferences about China are more confrontational at the moment than cooperative. So because German business has its interests in China, and German business, as you've described on the potential linkages and influence with policy on Russia, is no less powerful a player to do with enormous German exports and successful German exports to China.
So I would actually slightly disagree with the emphasis you place there, because of course it's American policy, but it's also Xi Jinping's policy. It's also the fact that, on the one hand, he has had a very repressive policy in Xinjiang, not to mention Hong Kong, and quite an assertive, to put it mildly, foreign policy, the statements on Taiwan, for example, but at the same time, anything but a level playing field for foreign businesses. So interestingly, German business in the case of China has begun to wake up to the fact that while it's been great for them for the last 20 years, it might not be so great if Xi Jinping realizes his plan, which is for Chinese industry to take all those technologies and then to take over making the things and exporting them. So that the BDI, the Confederation of German Industry, actually published a very critical report about China. So that I'm not sure it's quite true to say that German business is all pushing in the same direction here. I mean, of course, the German business interests are nonetheless huge. Volkswagen sells more cars in China than anywhere else, for example. But I think there is room there for a course adjustment in German policy, which is going to have to do what the rest of us are all having to do, which is in a way to do the splits, isn't it? That's to say, to understand that we have to keep a strong economic relationship with China, to work with them on climate change, on digital, on security, and at the same time that there is a genuine, very powerful competition, both geostrategic and ideological, going on. So that will be a huge test in the new coalition negotiations. But I think there is a chance. And by the way, I think the European Commission paper on China policy is a very sensible.
Yes, it's very balanced in terms of perspective. Yeah.
Extremely balanced with the triad of China being partner, competitor, and ideological rival. That's exactly right. On this wider issue, so by extension, not just Germany, but EU and post-election Germany, how do you see, because this issue of partnership with China, I would take that part of what you call the triad, the ideological part, I take as given. I mean, we have different values, different systems, different preferences, open democracy in one and not the other, etc. Authoritarianism, all of those things are clearly different. The competitor bit you've touched, the BDI, you want to protect your intellectual property, etc. Those elements are there. But the partnership element,
looks like it could get roughed up in the difficulties that, the nature of the Trump response to reach for trade as a weapon, and the apparent nature of the Biden foreign policy of America being back, but not necessarily in a way that looks an awful lot different to do with China.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple of interesting points there. One is, let's use the very loose phrase, a new Cold War, simply because it's illuminating, because it enables you to see what is similar and what is different. And of course, the huge difference is that we didn't depend on the Soviet Union for our economies, for parts of our technology, let alone for combating climate change. So that is actually, it's very hard to think of a period where the relatively rising and the relatively declining great power are so interconnected. I mean, you could perhaps say pre-1914 Europe. That's not a very encouraging comparison, but ancient Persia and ancient Greece were not so interconnected. And most of the great rising and falling empires didn't have this intense interconnection, so that it's actually a challenge to us, but also to them, of course, to see if one can be frenemies, to use, if you like, can cooperate and compete at the same time. But the other thing is its impact on the transatlantic relationship. And there I would make 2 points. One is, with Afghanistan, we see that across these 4 completely different American presidencies, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, couldn't be more different. But there is a sort of constant trend line of relative US withdrawal and a downgrading of the priority given to Europe. So that's a continuing trend. So they are making the case for strategic autonomy. At the same time, for them, clearly the relationship with China is issue number 1, totally understandably. And therefore, if Europe, greatly influenced by Germany, is not prepared to play ball, not to be on the same line, sensible people in Washington don't expect that, but to shift its position somewhat from, so to speak, the purely mercantilist position, to take account of the geostrategic, then I think the Biden administration in Washington will be very disappointed in Europe, and that will have a damaging effect on transatlantic relations. So there's a series of interesting interconnections, as between energy policy and Russia policy, so also between European-China policy and the future of transatlantic.
So on that, I see we don't have too long left, but on the transatlantic relations, that has been, of course, a huge part of the post-Second World War European construction. It was a huge part, ultimately, of that kind of conferring of legitimacy through reconciliation with post-war Germany, as Germany is a full member of the family and a full seat at the table, unlike Versailles and Clemenceau and all that happened in 1919. And when we look at that, I guess my question to you, as you followed the ebb and flow of this debate, what is the attitude and the appetite for formulating a distinctive German transatlantic approach and leadership, Germany to the alliance and Germany and Europe to the alliance, given Afghanistan, given recently what we've seen happen with the AUKUS, with Australia, UK and US, to do with South Pacific, and France's response and reaction to that, at least in the immediate term. It doesn't speak to a cozy relationship for the moment, but it doesn't necessarily speak to a determination to opt for strategic autonomy as Europeans.
I think you're exactly right. As you know, throughout the history of the Federal Republic, there have been Gaullist and Atlanticist tendencies, and the Atlanticist tendencies have usually won out. The Gaullist voices in Germany are now stronger, and the criticism of the United States is highly audible, also with an edge to it, a kind of cultural edge to it. We no longer need the American uncle. We're grown up now. And with an element of equidistance between the US, Russia, and China, all of that encouraging a rhetoric of strategic autonomy and European sovereignty. At the same time, Germany is light years away from getting serious about what it would mean to be, in security terms, and above all, hard military terms, genuinely autonomous, right? So that in security terms, people are still actually depending on NATO and therefore on the United States for their security. So I think the position is incoherent. And what I would like to see is a shared position of the Europeans, and in this case, I very much include Britain, even though it's not a member of the EU, in a new Euro-Atlanticist agenda, which is in a partnership with the United States, but with Europe doing more for itself, but correspondingly having a louder voice at the table.
We have only 4 minutes left, and I've deliberately stayed off one of the subjects which is not directly impinging the elections at the moment in Germany, but is part of the background. And that is what you think the effect of Brexit is for an incoming German administration in terms of how it positions its European policy with its other near neighbours.
So you want to depress me at the end?
Well, since you're in the UK at the moment, it's a bit of a curved ball to throw to you at the end, but I thought it would be good to have your view.
We managed to get by without the B word until the end. So I have an unusual view as a passionate English European, which is that actually potentially the most serious consequences of Brexit might be for the European project rather than for Britain. Obviously, it'll be bad for Britain. It may spell the end of the United Kingdom. There may be Scottish independence. There might even be a border poll in Northern Ireland. The country will be poorer and weaker and less influential. That's all. I take that for granted. But my hunch is we'll somehow muddle through. It won't be an absolute, someone rather nicely said it'll be an unspectacular failure. That's a nice way to put it. But I really do think that many of our European friends are underestimating the medium to long-term negative impact on the European project. A couple of reasons. First of all, we've touched a lot on security and foreign policy. How you're going to make an effective security and foreign policy if Britain is off doing something else with Australia or whatever, I do not know. That seems to me a really significant loss. Secondly, you will remember Princess Diana's famous description of her marriage when she said, there were 3 of us in our marriage, it was a little crowded. Well, in a curious way, what you had in the European Union with France, Germany, and Britain was 3 of us in the marriage, but ironically, it was what helped to make the whole thing work. Because it allowed for complex balances. If I, as a medium-sized or smaller member state, did not like something France and Germany were pushing, I could go to Britain and see what they thought about it. Similarly, Britain and Germany pushing an extreme economic liberal agenda, I could go to France. And so it enabled multiple complex balances, which, as you know, having worked to, at the heart of the European institutions, is so crucial to the way it continues to function. And now so much really does depend on France and Germany and then the other relationships around them. Italy, Spain, Poland, the Netherlands, other member states. But I think it makes it more difficult, paradoxically, when you've only got 2 in the marriage rather than 3, if I can put it that way. So that I do think, and also, the European project, which is now quite old as political projects go, we always think of it as young, but it's actually quite an old project, always depended on the sense that this was the way history is going. What I call the nimbus of irreversibility. And the nimbus of irreversibility has been shattered by the fact that a major member state could leave. So I think it's a major challenge. And my formula, which is the best I can come up with as an English European, is that actually I want post-Brexit Britain to do well, but I want the EU to do even better.
Sounds like the old days before Britain finally decided to apply. Those relativities stood after Les 30 Glorieuses and the Wirtschaftswunder and all of those years.
I'd say it would be a depressing conclusion, wouldn't it?
It would indeed. Look, I don't want to leave in a depressing conclusion. Your encyclopedic knowledge, your openness to meet us and take our questions, and your insights on what's happening in Europe, the wider world, and in particular today on Germany and the elections, are hugely appreciated. Timothy Gartenash, thank you so much for being our special guest today.
It was a great pleasure.
Our pleasure. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.